Good Freedom Friday to the conservative Americans out there. I am the conservative American, and I haven't done a video in a little while, so I sat down and thought that I would do something pertaining to a little bit of Thanksgiving, a little bit of history, and a little bit of one of the most precious things we have to be thankful for, and that is this free nation that we live in and the blessings that it has afforded us individually as well as vicariously others throughout the world, as uh, the blessings of this nation have allowed advancements in industrialization and standards of living. Um, a lot of talk today, there's been a lot of talk really since 2016 about the bitter partisan bickering back and forth and how bad it is and how it's off the charts. And let me make you feel better about this. This always happened. This always happened. There was always deep divided debate between politicians, between their constituents. And frankly, it was a lot worse back in the day. I don't recall any time in my lifetime that the two politicians in Washington, D.C. ever had an actual duel where one was shot and the other was the one that shot him. But that happened. A lot worse things happened. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is back in the early 1800s, America was still a very infant nation. It was on its very early history of the modern world. After the colonies had fought the Revolution and America was born as a nation in the early 1800s, the Napoleonic Wars with Britain were going on. So Britain was involved with these wars as Napoleon was seeking to leverage his value and his prominence in global trade. And that's what most of this stuff was always about, because global trade was the secret to creating wealth and maintaining wealth, and being able to staff very powerful armies and very powerful navies, who would enforce your tariffs and your trade desires. And however the world went was dictated by the most powerful, which so Britain is deeply embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars. And back in the early 1800s, um, citizenship didn't mean really exactly what it means today. By definition, it did, but as far as nations were concerned, it did not. And because of the wars going on, and because of the deep need for sailors and those who were versed in sailing and navigation, and even just general hands on some of these big warships of Britain, they were in desperate need of knowledgeable, practiced sailors, and they began to impress um, Americans or even non Americans, regardless of their citizenship, um, as they came into them, upon the high seas and other ways. They would impress them into forced servitude to work for the British Navy, to beef up their navy and to give them an upper hand in the Napoleonic Wars. And as this was happening, Britain was also impressing huge tariffs on American trade. Anything that was being traded between America and France in particular, the British wanted their hands on. As a matter of fact, the British wanted our sailing vessels with merchant marines to dock in their harbors prior to going to France, so that all items of commerce could be accounted for and subsequently taxed for Britain. Um, Between these tensions, there was obviously a lot of turmoil, and this was starting to make a lot of people mad. And you had a division in the nation along party lines, as is usually the case. Ironically, you had the Democrat Republicans. Yes, you heard that right. It was the Democrat Republican Party versus the Federalists. The Democrat Republicans typically fell along the lines of war hawks, meaning they wanted to do something about this. They weren't afraid to use force, and they felt that this needed to be dealt with swiftly and powerfully. Um, on June 18th, 1812, things boiled over, and things being almost evenly divided as they are today. Um, President James Madison was able to convince both houses of legislation to go forth with a declaration of war against Britain. So on the 6th month, the 18th day of the year 1812, war was declared against Britain. Well, what this did was things progressively got worse. The British Navy then, you got to remember at the time, America was a very small nation and our western border did not border the Pacific Ocean. We were isolated by frontier on the west, oceans to the south and to the east, and the Great Lakes to the north. So the British began to do blockades around ports. Their ships, especially their militarized ships, outnumbered American military ships at probably a ratio of somewhere around 20-1, maybe even a little bit more than that. As this was going on, they continued to enforce these blockades. This battled a lot more politics into it. It infused a lot of hate. People were taken again and continually impressed into the British Navy. And Britain thought that if they could control the seas, which would include the Great Lakes to the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the east, and then down to the Gulf of Mexico around Florida, that they would be able to isolate America from the world enough that they would eventually be able to bring it to their knees and get what they wanted. The British were also using, at the time, Chief Tecumseh, a Native American chief. As Tecumseh was already in motion basically to set up a little known thing that most people have never heard about called Tecumseh's Confederacy, in which he was trying to isolate some of the southern states and some of the southern territories for his own using, and Britain clamped onto that. So Britain uses him. They're basically fighting proxy wars using Tecumseh and Tecumseh's resources. And this goes on, as you know, the War of 1812, which is often called the Forgotten War. This goes on for a couple of years. Well, at the end of this fighting, again, talking about some of these people being gang pressed into the British Navy, there was a man by the name of Sir Francis Scott Key. Now, Sir Francis Scott Key was an attorney. He worked in Maryland and Washington, D.C. as an attorney. As a matter of fact, he would later go on to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia later in his life. Sir Francis Scott Key, as well as John Stewart, who was also part of this movement to go out and free people that had been oppressed, they had gone out to Her Majesty's ship Tonnant. It was just off the shore, just outside of a military fort. It was Fort McHenry. And they were going out and seeking negotiations with the British to release Dr. William Bean. He had been taken captive, and there's a lot of back and forth about what it really involved, but they felt that the British had no business taking possession of him, and he was also a close friend of Francis Scott Key's. So, believe it or not, in the middle of all these tensions, it was actually quite a polite party out on this British vessel where they went out, had dinner aboard the vessel. They wined, dined. They talked about various things, and they negotiated different agreements. And the agreement that they were working towards this day was to release this friend of Francis Scott Key's. So, as they're out there, the British are making plans, and the plan is that they are going to heavily bombard Fort McHenry. From where you see them in the ocean, they have guns that are capable of shooting what you'd actually remember seeing back in cartoons that looked like cannonballs, but they had a fuse in them. It would be shot from a gun, and the range on these were incredible. Some of the ranges on these would be astonishing, even by today's standards. The accuracy was something a little bit different. Now the bombs, which again, going back to, if you watched Saturday or early morning cartoons back in the 80s, would look like your typical cartoon bomb, but it would be loaded into a cannon barrel shot out, the fuse would be ignited, the interior of this ball would be filled with black powder, and if you timed it right, the bomb would land where you had a target that you wanted to destroy. The fuse would ignite the black powder would explode, and it would inflict heavy damage on whatever target was nearby. At one point in time, Fort McHenry, of course, was surrounded by great big ramparts. Ramparts are basically land, the soil is built up and beefed up to fend off attacks such as this. Well, inside Fort McHenry was a large magazine. Magazine is a term in military forts where weapons caches, ammunition caches, and because this was in 1812, barrels and barrels and barrels of black powder, which would be used for anything from musket fire to cannon fire, were dry stored inside of this magazine. At one point in time during this shelling, well, let's back up a little bit. Before the shelling began, and as they were talking about doing this, they had no problem in releasing Key from the vessel and letting him go back to shore. But they had been planning this while they had been having their little dinner party, trying to reach an agreement. Obviously, the British are not going to let him go ashore and risk him going and giving some kind of forewarning to the Americans that, hey, the British are planning to bombard the living landscape to oblivion. So they kept him aboard the ship. He wasn't necessarily there as a prisoner. He was free to go about what he wanted to do on the ship and watch. And that's what he was. He was a spectator of the front lines of this battle between the British Navy and Fort McHenry. One point in time, as this is being bombarded, and it starts on the morning or so of September 13th, 1814. They begin bombarding and bombarding and bombarding. Like I say, the cannon fire with these bombs was somewhat accurate. The distance on it was incredible. And one of these bombs happened to land in the magazine. There was a gentleman inside the magazine as it came through and penetrated the wall, and it's literally next to these hundreds and hundreds of barrels of black powder in dry storage. The fuse burns down, and it happened to be a dud. It never went off. Had that bomb gone off, that might have completely changed the outcome of the War of 1812. Well, what ended up happening was it was a dud. It didn't go off, and the whole time Key is on deck of the ship watching this bombing. Some of the bombs, the fuse timing would be off, or the distance would go greater than they anticipated, and they would just blow up in air. Another military artillery piece that they would use was the Congreve rockets. These rockets, for lack of a better description, basically giant bottle rockets. They would have a missile, so to say, on the top of it that was loaded with explosives and black powder and rocket fuel. And then on the back of it, it would have a tail of something that looked like a large broomstick. Because the rocket's heavy on the front, just like a bottle rocket, it's going to go out and it's going to keep generally going in the same direction from where you fired it. They're going to go up, they're going to make an arc, come down. Now, these weapons were entirely inaccurate. They were just kind of a pray and spray weapon. And predominantly what they did, and the British have used these successfully in many wars before, is they would go land somewhere, the things would explode, or the rocket would just continue to burn. And back in the day, a lot of structures were made of wood, straw, and other combustibles, and they would make rampant fires throughout cities, throughout the countryside, just destroying crops, destroying buildings, catching forts on fire. And it was, if you fire enough of these in the air, you're probably going to hit something and inflict some sort of damage that is going to optimize your military advantage if you're the one firing these rockets. So these rockets would take off, and again, in the fuel at the time, you'd have a big red tail of fire as the rocket fuel burned and it went in. And some of them would zig when you thought they would zag, and others would, you go up, explode early. Some of them would end up ditching in the sea. Some of them would never come close to their intended target. But again, this was something of of almost hand grenade military technology where it didn't need to be accurate. You just needed to fire enough of them. So this is going on, and it continues to go on for a period of about 25 hours. Um, at at the end of this military bombardment, uh, Francis Scott Key is out on the deck. It's bright and early on the morning of September 14th, 1814, and he does what he does best at the time, which is writing. He was very literate, obviously being an attorney, and he breaks out a piece of carbon and some parchment, and he begins to write down the words, "Say, can you see, by the dawn's early light, who so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming." And what he sees is, after all this bombardment and everything going into the rampart of this fort, is he sees a huge American flag. Now, the American flag, just prior to this time, had been drastically changed, and they did it in such a way that it was almost a weapon of war in itself, in that it would inspire morale of those who saw it and instill fear of those who saw it, depending on which side of the battle lines you were on. So he goes on to describe this: "Whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly, yeah, streaming. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" This song, or it wasn't a song, it just began as a poem that Mr. Key wrote, and it would later be put side by side with the tune and the melody of what used to be a song that was sang in drinking pubs, particularly in pubs that were clubs for members only, where a bunch of the more important people of society, or at least so they perceived themselves to be, would go in, and ironically, the lyrics and the cadence of that tune of this drinking song fit the lyrics that Key had written. And it didn't happen immediately, but over time, this was associated with that song and really became almost a long figure of speech in American history, to where it would later be attached to the nation as the anthem. Um, anyway, really cool history. Um, they ended up signing a peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent. In the end, not a whole lot changed, but Britain did back off from a lot of their stuff and respect American sovereignty more than they had before. And ironically, another little footnote to the War of 1812 is, after the peace treaty was signed, came one of the greatest plays in the War of 1812, which, as y'all remember the song, in 1814, we took a little trip down to New Orleans on the mighty Mississippi, and the military went down to New Orleans and had a major military victory. I believe that was led by General Jackson at the time. During that war, they pushed the British completely out of New Orleans. Um, the U.S. suffered somewhere in the neighborhood of, I believe, 76 losses to the British loss of about 250, a little bit shy of 250 people. Ironically, the war was over, but they didn't know it yet. And I guess, had the war not been over, this would have been just another reason for the British to sign a treaty and recognize America's sovereignty, and would have furthered towards the end of the war. But obviously, back then, messages over hundreds of miles did not travel at the speed of thought like they do today, or even like they did in the 1960s. Anyway, a lot of cool American history, and for this Freedom Friday on the Thanksgiving weekend, this just highlights some of the things that I think we all should be very thankful for. A lot of pundits and a lot of big mouths try to put down America. They try to make you feel ashamed for being American. Certainly, all humans are fallible, all nations are fallible. We have blemishes on our history. There's no question about that. But it is a history that is inspired by God, that began when the separatists who fled England due to religious persecution, they went to Holland. They spent 11 years in Holland, and then some 40, 50 of these separatists took a ship called the Mayflower, landed on Plymouth Rock. These people were very, very deeply religiously rooted in Judeo Christian values. They knew the Old Testament, the New Testament, and they modeled themselves after the, the people of that record and the deep religious convictions of that record. They never had any doubt that they would make that treacherous voyage across the ocean and be successful, and turned a Cinderella story, in historical terms, in the blink of an eye, to where people flocked to this great nation of opportunity that's blessed by God. And let us remember to always be humble about that. Let us remember also that we can be proud about that. We can be proud to be Americans. We can be proud to be the light to the world. Obviously, we don't do everything right, but we do a lot of things darn right. Anyway, that's going to close out my Freedom Friday. I went a little bit long here, but it's a lot of history, and it's history that is long forgotten. Like I say, they call the War of 1812 the Forgotten War, and so much of what is wrong with our nation today is that our citizens have a huge lack of understanding of America, what built America, what America came from, the Judeo-Christian values that made America wonderful, the capitalist system that was set up going clear back to the original colony that was set up with the separatists who were fleeing religious persecution. And we still, to this day, despite the bickering and despite everything bad we see going on in the world, we can still be proud to look back and see that Star-Spangled Banner and remember what it stands for, and try to be better. Try to be better each day. Try to be more civil each day. But political discourse has always been ugly. In the past, it was far uglier than it is today. And it's almost one of those necessary evils. So let not your heart be troubled by the politics going on today, and don't live in despair. Live in hope that things are always going to get better. That there is so much to be thankful for. And with that said, we'll go ahead and close this out. So until next time, keep a smile on your face, keep working hard, and we'll go from here.